Invite you to think with me about some of the really on-the-ground kinds of issues that we face, but also the challenges for how to work with this. And I want to take you back to, we'll get back to Exodus again in all of this. The notion of being in the wilderness and keeping on the move. But the fact of the matter is that even when we're on the move, we always carry stuff with us. Anytime we talk about these kinds of changes and new people coming into a parish, new people coming into a community, we're always talking about this sort of mix between old and new, right? And one of the people who has really helped me think about how some of this works is a sociologist named Ann Swidler, and Eric's going to just, Eric's in my class, and he knows I love Ann Swidler. And one of the key distinctions that she makes is between settled cultures and unsettled cultures, saying that culture just works differently. When you're talking about a situation where people are more or less in a routine, more or less settled in one place and with one group of people, in comparison to situations where people are on the move, new mix, new technologies, no matter what it is, things come along that unsettle our way of being in the world. And in settled cultures, one of the things she noticed is that the patterns of culture are pretty much there by habit, which means that we don't ever stop to have to explain them to anybody, right? We just do them. We just know how to be. And that means that the link between what we're actually doing and the ideas that explain what we're doing, maybe our theology, our ecological or ecclesiology, those things may not necessarily be very closely linked to what we're actually doing, just because we're just doing it. We're just, in the groove. Unsettled cultures are places where we are, in fact, remaking our folk ways, our ways of being, and where we're having to explain ourselves. And that means that these are times when, when people who can explain, who can give you ideas for how to think about things, are especially powerful and important people in those kinds of cultures, and where you're all having to make this link more explicit between what we're doing and why we're doing it. So what I want to suggest is that we're all in an unsettled situation, and in fact, that we're sort of called to stay in that unsettled situation. And here we are back at Exodus. Because there's an interesting point in the story, fairly early on in their journeying out into the wilderness, where, they've been complaining as usual. We don't, we used to have it so good back there in Egypt. We had the, we knew the food. We knew what we were supposed to do. We knew where we were living. And, Moses is trying to get them used to being in the wilderness and figuring out new food and where we're going to get water and all of the rest. And there's this really interesting verse in the 16th chapter where it says, the whole community of Israel turned toward the wilderness, and there they saw the glory of God. And I just think it's really interesting that they didn't look back at Egypt and see the glory of God. And they didn't even actually look toward the promised land and see the glory of God. They saw the glory of God in the wilderness. So that's the invitation I'm issuing to you here. An invitation to go into that unsettled wilderness, but realize when you get there that you're still going to be having some of that baggage from the settled culture. And to think about how are we going to figure out where that is? How are we going to figure out where the stumbling blocks are that we're going to run into because we're still operating with habits that came from Egypt, but we're actually in the wilderness. So I want to just give you a few little tips, pointers for how to think about really being much more intentional and systematic about looking at the existing culture of your parish and looking for those places where there are these habits that you haven't asked, why are we doing that, in a while? So looking at a culture I like to talk about it in terms of 3 A's, looking at the artifacts, the accounts, and the activities. Looking at those things that we do and make and talk about together as a community. So when I talk about artifacts, I'm really talking about all of the things that we make together as a community. And the things we make are the things that help to give some structure and order to our community. So they're everything from the buildings that we build, the bells that toll to tell us that something important has happened, the signs out front, the bulletins we produce, all of that stuff that we produce are our artifacts, and they're unique to our particular culture. So looking around at artifacts is one of the important things to do to start to get a sense of what is this taken for granted culture that's here that might not necessarily be taken for granted by new people who are coming in. So one of the ways that you can do that is to do various kinds of inventories or space tours, getting people who are perhaps the old-timers in the parish to give tours to newcomers, or just getting a group of old-timers in the parish together to walk through that space and have them tell you the stories about what happened in that space so that you have a sense of why it may be so important to them and how it might become a different kind of space also for new people coming in. Doing this kind of looking at the material world that we're inhabiting intentionally with new and old eyes is part of learning enough about the culture to be able to start to make the bridges with some of the new people who may be part of the community. So, second A, accounts, the things we say, how we speak. Part of a culture, obviously, we've already been talking about it, language, right? A really critical part of the culture that each community has. But it's not just the literal language, although that's hugely important, as I'm already hearing and as you know. But it's also just the little stuff about, how we refer to things, the jargon, the abbreviations. I mean, does a newcomer really know what RCIA is? If you invite them to come, are they going to know what they're being invited to come to? What are the things that are our special ways of talking about things? The little shorthand things. Like, when a group has been together for a long time, it has its own jokes and stories that are just the kind of, the lore of the community. And if you've been around for a long time, nobody has to tell the whole story. You just have to refer to a phrase or a reference to that story. And, everybody who's also an old timer knows, oh, that time Joe did whatever. They know exactly what you're talking about. But a newcomer doesn't. So becoming aware of how we speak, the language, the jargon, the references, and so forth, is also important. And of course, accounts are also stories, right? They're the stories we tell about who we are, about the immigrants who came and built this place, came from Italy, brought the marble over, or whatever it is that they did, that become the history of this place, that say something about who we are, or at least who we used to be. But the stories that we tell are also the big, important theological stories, the biblical stories that shape who we are together as a community. And one of the things you learn, of course, is that different communities go to different places in the theological canon, in the canon of Scripture, in the pantheon of saints. There are different pieces of those major stories that are important to different communities. So listening to stories, unsettling those settled accounts. One of the things you can do is appoint a jargon measurer, inventorier, have somebody whose job it is for a month to be in meetings jotting down all the times when somebody uses some term that might not be just common lingo to everybody. You can do one-on-ones, borrow from the community organizing folks, have people do what you guys just did in the breakouts before we went to break. Actually create opportunities for people to tell each other their stories. Which means that you do have to invite people into places other than just the pews in Mass on Sunday morning. They have to meet somewhere other than in the parking lot as one group is coming and another group is going. You have to get intentional about creating these places where the different cultures can begin to know each other. So, third A, activities. And for parishes, of course, those activities are various kinds. They're activities that have to do with our spiritual life, activities that have to do with how we build community, activities of engaging in service, and committee meetings. With spiritual activities, spiritual work that we do together, beginning to really get serious about thinking about how do people feel close to God? What are the things we do that for different groups of people in the parish are the places of connection? Is it the music? Is it the prayers? Is it coffee hour? Is it something else that is the place where people are finding that sense of connection to God? And one of the things you're going to want to do if you're going to unsettle the culture is experiment a little bit with how those connections are getting made and then be willing to be light on your feet. I'll say more about that in a minute. We also are teaching people about our spiritual traditions, and people are going to learn both knowledge and skills at various practices, and they're going to learn that both because we intentionally teach them and because they're watching. We're also going to be doing activities that are actually building the community, and as we think about how do we gather to sing and to eat together. Now, I recognize that both singing together and having all kinds of fellowship activities and meals together may not be things that Catholic parishes do as intensely and often as perhaps many Protestant parishes do. In fact, it's kind of interesting to see the fact that you have very large parishes, and not everybody who is on the rolls or even who shows up for Mass once a month has an opportunity to actually be together with other people in the parish in some other setting. So one of the things that may have to happen to really see how communities are going to come together is, again, creating more opportunities for these kinds of encounters and work together. One of the places, however, where the cultural bridging is very likely to happen first, frankly, is in working together on doing things that serve the community. I have a student who's working on looking at the churches in South Africa and looking at the challenges that they face post-apartheid. And they've made the kind of theological transition to say, all those ideas we had about how, Afrikaner nationalism was a good thing, bad. That's actually really a sin. The ideas they've got. But on the ground, how are we going to actually bring our parishes together? That's much more difficult. Not unlike, I think, some of what we're facing. But what my student is discovering is that in local communities, they all share concerns about various things that need to happen. problems that are facing the community, economic disparities, children who need help, all kinds of things. And it's at that level that parishes that are different from each other are coming together and actually working together and beginning to bridge some of those very old and very deep divides. So service projects may not be a bad place to start. Committee meetings probably aren't. And yet eventually, you're going to have to think about how do we bring different cultures of decision-making together in a parish as well. So how do we think about unsettling the patterns of how we do things in a parish? Those ways of organizing our worship, our religious education, our service, all of those things that we just, well, that's the way we've always done it, right? It's just part of who we are. Well, one of the things you can do is literally, again, do a calendar inventory. Look at what you're actually doing and ask, where are the places in that calendar where there are opportunities for people to be together, to actually do things together? And which of your activities are the most accessible across cultures, and which ones have the biggest barriers? Look at that calendar and really take that seriously. So, just to sum up this business about assessing your culture, every congregation, every parish has one. And I'm not just talking about ethnicity, okay? Every congregation, every parish has ways of being together. It has a world it has made, a way of being in the world. It has made its buildings, its tools, its ways of materially giving order to that world. It has invented stories. It has created a set of activities that are its routine ways of being present together. And all of those things that constitute the existing culture are things that are taken for granted by the people who've been there a long time, and often aren't even really noticed until something comes along to unsettle them. Sometimes that something is from the outside. You have to merge. You have to share your parish. New people in the community. And in the midst of that, or just intentionally, you can decide to unsettle that culture and take the role of the newcomer and start to gather really systematic observations about what this culture really looks like, and think about how you could be a guide to the culture and invite new people into that culture because you understand what's actually there and aren't just taking it for granted. So, Hosffman, tell us some more.
Well, to pick up on a line that Nancy just shared with us, what can be more unsettling than one day getting a letter from the bishop and say, your parish is going to be merged, closed, yoked, They have all sorts of language for this, Or what about a parish for, something more unsettling than being a, say, mostly white community that, which has been the pattern in the United States, and then a new pastor arrives, and the pastor happens to speak Spanish, and then the pastor opens the community to the Hispanic community, to Hispanic Catholics. So the first Sunday, you get the 20 Hispanic Catholics. That's not threatening, 20 Hispanics, Mass in Spanish. It's actually cool because we're open to diversity, isn't it? And then, 2 months later, it's 200 people, And then we'll say, well, we're doing a service, And then a year later, 60% of the parish is Hispanic, And then those people are taking over, It's just, that's unsettling. That's what's happening in the Catholic Church. Bilingual communities, So, for instance, we are beginning to see a pattern that I find a little bit unsettling in many ways, not to continue to use the word. But then you have these, parishes that have two language communities or two ethnic communities, and then they say, well, if you can do it in English and Spanish, well, I'm pretty sure you can do it in Vietnamese too, isn't it? And maybe you can do, let's add a little bit of Cape Verdean, or Portuguese, and serve the Cape Verdean community. And then we encounter parishes throughout the United States, that serve, for instance, 4, 5, 6. I actually encountered a community that serves 7 different language communities, multicultural communities. Very unsettling. But even if it is a community, right now, for instance, here in the Northeast, the Archdiocese of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and many others are actually undergoing process of consolidation of communities, So sometimes it's 2 Hispanic communities getting together. And then all of a sudden you have a Puerto Rican parish and a Mexican parish, coming together. Not an easy change for everyone. Or what about, 2 or 3 white Catholic communities, parishes, coming together? That's very unsettling as well, because we are used to these ways, as Nancy has been reminding us. So, as we reflect about it, with the bishops of the United States, there's a number of scholars and pastoral leaders thinking that if we are going to thrive in the 21st century with strong communities, because communities matter, congregations matter, we want our parishes, we want to have them, and we want them to grow and to be sources of life for the next generation of Catholics. We've got to develop a number of skills and abilities, or actually the word that's being used today is competencies. We all must learn, beginning from all the way from bishops, clergy, pastoral leaders, all the way to families at home. We need to develop what is called intercultural competencies. What's an intercultural competence? Intercultural competence, according to the USCCB, Conference of Bishops, is the capacity to communicate, relate, and work across cultural boundaries, okay? And again, this is not exclusively directed towards ethnic boundaries. It could be social boundaries, could be ideological boundaries as well. It involves developing capacity in 3 areas: knowledge, skills, and attitudes, okay? Now, brace yourselves, because we're gonna enter into this world of, in 10 minutes, of intercultural competencies, So what pretty much the bishops, have come to realize with a sense of humility, inviting pastoral leaders to also think, is that when it comes down to unsettled circumstances, most of us are incompetent, to deal with them, because we want our way. We want things, I remember my parish as it was in the 1960s, or the 1950s. This is the way we used to do things, And then you get immigrants, from the Dominican Republic or from Mexico saying, oh, this is how we did it in Mexico. Well, you know what? This is the United States of America. This is 21st century. This is not the 1950s. This is not Mexico. This is not Uganda. This is not Vietnam. Hey, we have to learn how to be community. We got to develop the skills and the abilities and the knowledge to do this. Knowledge involves, on the one hand, to understand that, there's more than one perspective on things. Just to settle. I mean, it seems a lot of this, what I'm sharing here, is commonsensical, but, Bernard Lonergan used to say that that's precisely the first level of knowledge where we all fail, common sense, So we just got to have some common sense about this, There's more than one perspective about reality, When we say worship of God, when we talk about God, perhaps not all of us are imagining an old man with a white beard, for instance, or standing on a cloud. Maybe we're looking at a woman. Maybe we're looking at imagining, a person working in a field. What's the image of God, So we need to start opening ourselves up to these different dynamics. Also, knowledge involves that there are different interpretations of the same cultural reality. When you say church, what does it mean to be church? When you say Christian initiation, What is Christian initiation? When you say religious education, I'll give you a practical example in the Hispanic community. In the Euro-American Catholic world, you say religious education, and everybody immediately imagines K through 12 catechesis in the parish. In the Hispanic community, religious education means you go the year before receiving your sacrament, you receive the sacrament, and then disappear. Why? Because your community and your family are supposed to continue the catechesis. We don't get it. We just don't understand. Different patterns, But we must be open to this. We need to know about it. We need to research. Knowledge of general dynamics of intercultural communication, how we interact with one another, And intercultural communication is just a fascinating dynamic, For instance, when do we shake hands? When do we hug? One of the first cultural shocks I always share when I came to the United States, was the fact that when I was I would greet people, and particularly my sisters and brothers who were Euro-American, Well, in the Hispanic community, we're always hugging, we're hugging, we love to hug one another, But then I always noticed that people will give me the hand just like that, And the further away, the better, But I've got to respect that, I've got to respect. It's intercultural communication, How do you interact with people? How do people express their ideas? What kind of poetry? When you read poetry in English, it doesn't sound the same way as when it's translated into Spanish, So we have to learn how to appreciate poetry in English and poetry in Spanish in those original language, and that's part of intercultural communication, When, for instance, in the Hispanic community, my own parish, the Hispanic choir resists, let me repeat, resists to do mass with the organ. They just can't do the organ. They've got to have their congas, and they've got to have their guitars and so forth. And I remember some Anglo people saying, oh, we already did the congas and the guitars in the 1970s. Remember those years? We did it, and they didn't work for us. Well, it worked for Hispanics, and it works for Africans. So we got to respect these ways, these forms of communication. And also, this is a time to learn more than one language, more than one first language, particularly for those who are in positions of leadership. Do the effort. And if you can learn 2 or 3 words, in this multilingual, multicultural church, do the effort. Make the effort. It is important. It is important. But the language is not only the language. Actually, like English or Spanish or Vietnamese or Portuguese. It's also the different languages. For instance, the technology language, I mean, have you ever received a Twitter from someone who is 16 or 17, a tweet, My goodness, you need a dictionary, I constantly find myself going to Google to understand what my undergraduate students are writing. Like, what is this 3 letters and a sign number, like, a number sign, I don't know what that is, So I got to go. The whole hashtag thing, well, I'm not going to go into that, But those are languages. We got to learn those new languages, the language of the people, the language, the language of the poor, the language of, how women, express in themselves, in their communities, in different cultures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Skills entail, on the one hand, the ability to empathize, If in a culturally diverse church, we cannot begin with the idea of distrusting each other all the time. If we distrust each other, we will always consider one another enemies, We need to go beyond that. We need to empathize, One of the test cases that I always present in multicultural communities, particularly in the Southwest, dealing with issues dealing with issues of immigration, How do you empathize with immigrants, I know that the issue of immigration tends to be thorny because, some people say we have to respect the laws, you have to do this, you come to the country legally. We have our own political, ideological, political, or social perspectives, which is fine. We need to have them. But what do you do with the mother, who came to the country undocumented, and is raising 2 or 3 children, and one day there is a raid, an immigration raid, she's taken away, and her 3 children are somewhere lost in the system? Are we able to empathize with that? Are you able to empathize with the 40-year-old, with the 50-year-old immigrant who arrives in the United States and works full-time and then has 2 part-times and then works extra time, so have all this and then doesn't have time to study English, and then we say, here we only speak English. Are we able to empathize with these people? Are we able to empathize with people who don't have time to go to college? Are we able to empathize with people who, or the other way around? Are immigrants willing to empathize with, the community that built the parish, has ownership of the parish, but now sees that it's being taken away? So we have to begin to develop this, develop that skill, the skill of empathy, ability to tolerate ambiguity. Not everything is black and white, Some things are, there are things that are, there's a lot of gray in our lives and in the way we operate, Ability to adapt communication and behavior according to the different realities. These are real skills that everyone in diverse communities needs to develop, and again, taking the concept of diversity in a large way. And finally, developing attitudes. Attitudes include, 1, openness to others and other cultures. We got to be open to otherness in many ways. We cannot think that we are the center of the world or that we are the only ones who deserve to be in these communities. As a matter of fact, we didn't build our churches for ourselves. We build the churches for the Catholic community and these parishes, for the community. And these parishes, we want them to thrive and we want them to remain open and vibrant, So, but that requires an openness to this diversity that is transforming the way of being Catholic in this country. Wanting to learn, it's not only a matter of being open, but it's also a matter of wanting to learn and engage other cultures. You want to have the desire to engage the other person, And some people say, I'm too old for these things. I can't learn another language. I can't, deal with diversity. I don't understand those young people. I don't understand those urbanites, I don't understand. Well, if you don't understand, if you think they're too old, at least try, okay? Try. It's just the beginning of building community. It's the beginning of being one another, wanting to learn and engage other cultures. Understanding that intercultural interaction is a way of life, not a problem to be solved. And perhaps this is one of the biggest plugs that I want to make as we advance these reflections. Cultural diversity and settled communities are not a problem, my friends. This is who we are, diverse. This is not a problem to be solved. I feel really bad when some people say, sometimes I get phone calls or emails, from leaders who say, Dr. Ospino, would you like to come to our diocese, or would you like to come and speak to our group about the Hispanic problem? And and I'm thinking, so I'm the problem because I'm Hispanic. It's not a problem to be solved, It's not a problem to be solved. It is, the bishops of the United States, as a matter of fact, have spoken about this. The Hispanic presence and the presence of diversity in the Catholic Church is an opportunity, it's a blessing for the Church in the United States. We all are a blessing to one another, And we need to learn how to appreciate those blessings. And finally, attitudes include mindfulness. Just be mindful of who we are and be mindful of the new voices. Be mindful of the new realities that we are facing, We're mindful that we're different, that we have hopes, One of the examples that I love to share with my students is what I have experienced in my own parish. My own parish community, St. Patrick Parish in Lawrence, Massachusetts. My wife and I oversee Hispanic ministry there, and something that we have learned is that when we start butting our heads, to resolve technical issues or deal with who does this or who's more important than that, we never solved anything. But whenever we start by looking at how human we are, human needs, One of the best examples that I can give you is, two groups of people, big meeting, white leaders on one side, Hispanic community on the Hispanic leaders on the other side. It was like high school dance, boys and girls, each one on side, one speaking English, one speaking Spanish, and looking at each other with distrust, Then one of the white ladies starts talking about her son, who was imprisoned. And she was crying, telling her white friends, that her son had gone to prison. And then this lady on the other side, the Hispanic lady, she overhears and she says, I understand what you mean, because my son also was sent to prison a number of years ago, and how horrible that was. And then they started talking and sharing experiences. By the end of the meeting, the groups are were mixed, Let's be mindful of one another, and let's not remember that we are both human and called to be disciples of Christ in building these communities.
I'm going to share a few things with you that are actually saying some of the same kinds of things in a different way. Because what I'm going to share with you are observations that came originally out of research I was doing in the 1990s in communities that were undergoing transitions in the communities, and looking at the congregations that were existing in those communities and trying to figure out how are congregations responding? And these were, across lots of different religious traditions, not just Catholic parishes. But we noticed some interesting sort of patterns that were very different among the congregations that were most sort of agile, if you will, on their feet in responding to the new situation that they were confronting, compared to the congregations that seemed to be, even if they didn't quite know it yet, on their way toward the grave. And what I've dubbed this is 7 Habits for Transitional Leadership, borrowing from somebody else, I believe. And I want to say leadership, not leader necessarily, because these are not necessarily things that were just found in one sort of dynamic, charismatic, strong leader person. When we looked at these parishes and these congregations of all sorts, these are skills, habits of mind, ways of being that characterized a group of people who were able to lead together into a new situation. And the first of these is just curiosity. One of the striking things, and this is very similar to what you've just been hearing from Hosffman, one of the striking things about the congregations that were moving into a new situation in creative new ways is that they'd actually paid attention to what was going on around them. The ones that were on the other side of the ledger, we actually had people saying, really, there's been a change in our neighborhood? Hadn't noticed. It was kind of amazing that, congregations in Brighton, were saying, really, there are people who speak Portuguese? They kind of hadn't noticed. So curiosity, an important skill, capacity to continue to cultivate, to pay attention to what's going on out there. But it's not just paying attention to what's going on out there. It's also doing the kinds of things I was talking about a few minutes ago. Constantly paying attention to who we are and being really honest in our own self-assessment about the strengths we have, about the weaknesses we have, about who we are, about what the things are that we can bring to this new world. Now, entrepreneurship is something that, every business leader is going to tell you that's what a successful, leader has to have. And I'm not really fond, actually, of using this term because it does have that sort of businessy management kind of overtone to it. But it fits in this sense. That is that an entrepreneur is somebody who can imagine how to find resources they didn't necessarily know they already had and put them to uses that nobody had quite thought about putting them to before. Okay? And that's indeed something that parishes that are going to be adaptive have to be able to do that. They have to look at the resources they already have or have access to, be able to imagine how those resources might be marshaled to do things they haven't been able to do before. They've also got to be willing to just experiment. One of the things that was so striking was that people in parishes that were adapting were able to tell us stories about failures. They were able to tell us stories about times when they tried something and it didn't work. And they said, okay, we'll try something else. There was a kind of habit of mind that said it's okay to try something. Even if we're not guaranteed in advance, we know the bottom line will be it will succeed. I think it's called going out on faith. And what undergirds this as well is a sense of imagination. But I want to say imagination in a lot of the ways that Hosffman was just talking about. The ability to empathize, to see symbols and stories and rituals and, images that aren't necessarily the ones you've always known about. And be able to bring that imaginative element here, that element of, that's not just our heads, thinking things out, but our hearts and our abilities to think about what things might look like, to adopt ways of worshiping that are perhaps new and, maybe don't come from either old culture or new culture, but are kind of invented all over again. So imagination, a habit of mind that goes with this kind of adaptive world. And deep hospitality. All the things that Hosffman's has been talking about. I'm not just talking about having an usher at the back door who shakes your hand and says, welcome. Although that's not a bad idea. But I am talking about welcoming strangers. And hear both those words. Welcome and recognizing that in fact they are strange to you. And you're going to have to welcome, which means opening, listening, engaging, all of the things that we've been talking about. And eventually welcoming those strangers into the most sacred places, the places that you sort of, want to keep private and special, like the boardroom, where you actually make decisions about who gets to have what mass and how the resources get distributed and all those things. Deeply hospitable. And when you do, of course, there is going to be conflict. I guarantee it. It is the only correlation I have ever seen in my sociological career that was a 1.0 correlation. Those of you who've had your statistics, perfect correlation, that is, every single successfully adapting congregation in our study had significant conflict. And every single dying congregation in this study was a happy little camper family. That's a really telling discrepancy. But it's also scary. Because most of us would rather be the happy family than the fighting parish. But if you're not willing to engage the conflict, the change won't happen. Period. So 7 habits, 7 good organizational skills. The kind of thing, yeah, indeed, a management consultant might tell you you need. But there's something that's really goes beyond and runs through all of these habits that make them distinctive to the work we do with parishes. And that is an 8th habit, the habit of engaging in spiritual discernment, the habit of bringing God to the table, the habit of looking for the presence of the Spirit amongst all of the things that we're trying to do together, and listening hard for what the Spirit has to tell us about the ways that we can come together so that, as the Exodus story reminds us, so that God may dwell among us. That's our work. That's the hard work of moving from point A to point B, but recognizing that point B is not where we're going to just settle, that we're going to stay in the wilderness. And all of these habits for adaptation are permanent skills that have to be part of our lives. So, Hosffman, join me up here.
Well, so now what we would like to do is, we have about 8 minutes to solve the problems of the world, and imagine a new way of being church, and certainly mindful of the dynamics in our communities. So we just want to open it up to you at this very moment. Once again, questions, observations, reactions. I guess that I would emphasize more your reactions and your own thoughts more than the questions, because Nancy and I can make up an answer. But
Talk to each other.
that's right. But certainly we're interested in your thoughts. So let's begin. So over there, back then, gentlemen. Yep.
Thank you. I just won a job interview for being an associate director of Maryknoll Missions, so on the West Coast, and I need to be learning to interface with the front lines of parishes to kind of say that all those goals that we were just facing, how do we get intercultural competencies? One of those might be taking the immersion group and for 3 months learning something about a culture, and then going to that culture, going abroad, becoming a guest, and then anticipating, wait a minute, I'll be able to take something from this experience to be a hospitable presence back in my home parish. So I took some excitement as I go to this interview, and I'll think, oh, yeah, I want to make this kind of, this networking skill and make this kind of pitch, and it's something I have to offer parishes and say, we're all changing, and this is something within reach. So
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Two, and then Susan. If you can just you need to use that so you get on the record too.
I think everything we've been talking about today is based in one word, and that is attitude. And that's what I'm saying. Everything is driven off attitude. If you don't have the right attitude, then nothing's going to happen.
Thank you very much for today. It was inspiring. I wonder, have you thought about, or would the university think about offering this on a Saturday, where people could bring parish councils and people who work in ministry full-time or part-time, because those of us who are here today have the luxury of being here today, whereas the people, I think, that would benefit from this cogent and wonderful talk are people that are working in other places. I just wondered if that might be a possibility.
Hopefully they might have access to the recorded presentations and to your wisdom as it has come from the audience.
Right.
And maybe gathering small groups of people in either a parish or a group of parishes to,
Right, that could be,
to
but-
do that.
Right.
Yeah.
But there is
It's a
something,
great idea.
just as you mentioned earlier, there is something about the physical reality and the opportunity for interaction
Yeah.
among the folks
Absolutely.
from different places.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Melinda has taken note of your suggestion, so over there as well. Yes, and please.
Thank you both. First of all, I hope we can get like a reading list, because I need a crash course in some of these things. But secondly, I'm wondering how you would begin to, oh, fabulous. I'm wondering how you might begin to translate some of these skills into a world where we see the rising number of the nuns and the high rates of de-affiliation from parish life.
That's my other talk.
Absolutely. Yes, over there, and then.
There's a thing called Catholic Television based here in Watertown, and Father Robert Reed has in the past visited various Christian Catholic families and kind of profiled them. Has he visited various Catholic parishes that have more or less succeeded in this challenge that you've presented, and then from that make little DVDs that can be used to augment your program?
Well, I'm not familiar with the program, but certainly Susan and maybe someone who works for the Archdiocese, that could be a recommendation, that will be very helpful as well, an entire series on these communities. So, but not to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if that has been done, but certainly it's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Underlying those 7 beautiful habits for transitional leadership, I heard commitment, and maybe it could be highlighted that individuals and communities of parishes make a commitment to love, to learn, to appreciate, to forgive others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Any other comments, thoughts, reactions? Over here, we have one hand up. Oh, great.
Thank you very much for the presentation this morning. I come from a parish south of Boston in Brockton, and we have a large community of Haitian folks that are in our parish. They came to us from Sacred Heart Parish, which is a French national parish originally. They came to us when the French parish closed and the school closed. What we found when they first come over was that there was no communication. And for example, we have adoration on Monday nights in the parish. We've had it for years. And I went down one Monday night at 8 o'clock for an hour of adoration and found that the church was hopping alive with all this Caribbean music. And I couldn't quite figure this out. And I started to walk in, and a couple of ladies walked out in dismay that the Haitian folks just came in and took over and drove them out. Well, needless to say, a few of those ladies were very upset. So we sat down, we had a talk with the Haitian priest, and he didn't realize that nobody had communicated the fact that they wanted to use the church that night as part of their 3-day celebration. So since then, we have slowly but surely started to work out communications with, particularly with the priest, the Haitian priest. And this year, we don't run into that anymore because we have sat down, we've worked out our schedule. They have twice a year they want to use the church on a Monday night. And because it's all of God's work, we can sit back and take that night off and probably catch up on one of our TV shows, but that's a different story. But that's what I see is happening in our parish, and the communications are starting to come about. So
Thank you.
really
Thank you for sharing that story.
For your insights on this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I think that Melinda, so.
I just want to, before you do that, let me just tell you what I've been flashing on the screen here. There is a website called studyingcongregations.org, which is a place for finding tools for thinking about precisely the kinds of questions we've been talking about this morning. Among other things, there is a very long reading list that you can find on this website. And so I would just invite you to enjoy it.